Make it 6. That's the number of Republican-backed restrictive voting measures that courts have either struck down or weakened over the past 2 weeks. From North Carolina, where a federal court found the GOP aimed to block African-American voters with, quote, almost surgical precision, to most recently North Dakota, where a law was found to discriminate against Native Americans. Now joining us is Berman. He's senior contributor for The Nation and author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. So Ari, this is the first presidential election since the Supreme Court gutted the 1964 Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder. There was a slew of moves by states that were sort of unhindered by the federal government. They passed a number of voting rights laws. So talk about the significance of these 6 states where courts have weighed in, and some of these were not known to be liberal courts. Some of these are conservative courts as well.
Yeah, so it was a remarkable string of victories, both for the laws that were struck down, but also for the decisions themselves. So some of the country's worst voting restrictions, like in North Carolina, were struck down, but they were also struck down in a way that was really notable. In North Carolina, for example, the courts found evidence of intentional discrimination against black voters. They said that black voters were targeted with, quote, almost surgical precision, which is really remarkable language for a court to use. In Texas, where the voter ID law was ruled against and softened, the decision was written by a George W. Bush appointee. In North Dakota, where the courts found that voter ID law discriminated against Native American voters, that was written by a George W. Bush appointee. So we're seeing almost a bipartisan reaction in the courts against the country's most egregious laws. And luckily it's coming, right before the election, so that people will now hopefully have enough time to vote in November in some of these states with the worst voting restrictions previously on the books.
So Donald Trump told the Washington Post, quote, the voter ID situation has turned out to be a very unfair development. We may have people vote 10 times. So he's referring to these slew of decisions. How do you respond to arguments like that? Has there really been any evidence of that happening?
No. So voter impersonation, which is the only type of fraud that a voter ID law would stop, is exceedingly rare. There have been only 31 credible incidents of voter impersonation since 2000 out of 1 billion votes cast. So this whole notion of voter fraud, particularly voter impersonation, has been a manufactured crisis by the Republican Party to try to build support for laws making it harder to vote. I'm not surprised Trump, who questioned the citizenship of the first black president, would now be reacting negatively to court decisions overturning voter suppression laws. But the fact is there's absolutely no basis in fact for what he's saying. And indeed, the courts in states like North Carolina and Texas and Wisconsin grappled very directly with these voter fraud questions. They said that, number one, there was very little evidence of voter impersonation to begin with. In Wisconsin, for example, they didn't present a single case of voter impersonation in court to justify their voter ID law. And they said that in a lot of cases, ironically, the voter ID laws would make the problem of fraud worse, because in North Carolina, for example, the state is requiring ID for in-person voting, where fraud is very rare, but they're not requiring IDs for absentee voting, where fraud is more common. Still rare, but more common. And the reason why that's happening is because Democrats and African Americans are more likely to vote in person, and Republicans and white voters are more likely to vote absentee. So the court said that under the guise of combating voter fraud, in fact, North Carolina is likely going to make voter fraud more common. So that's really why these arguments don't stand up.
And so to be clear, these court rulings aren't final necessarily, but is it likely that they'll get appealed to the Supreme Court with Scalia no longer serving there and the court being split?
So North Carolina said it's going to try to appeal, but it's unlikely the court's going to hear the appeal because they're deadlocked 4-4. It's not even clear that Justice Kennedy would necessarily side with the conservatives to overrule the lower court. So this is being done well before the election. There have been extensive trials in these cases. The circuit courts have been very careful with their opinions. So I don't think the Supreme Court, unless barring some major unforeseen development, is going to step in. Texas, which has sued the Obama administration more than any other state, just said they're not going to go to the Supreme Court because they don't believe they can win. So they've settled this case, which means in Texas that those people without voter IDs will still be able to cast a ballot, which is a major victory for voters there. So the death of Justice Scalia has really transformed the voting rights landscape.
And finally, we've seen, I think we had talked off camera, I think 15 states with restrictive voting measures on the books right now, at least. But on the other hand, you have some news in Oregon, I believe, where they actually sort of went the other way. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in Oregon and how it kind of bucks the trend we've seen in these Republican-controlled states?
Yeah, so as Republican-controlled states have largely made it harder to vote, we're seeing that blue states controlled by Democrats are starting to make it easier to vote. And Oregon is really leading the way on this because they're doing what's called automatic voter registration. So when you go to the DMV to get a driver's license or a state ID, you are automatically registered to vote. You don't have to do anything affirmatively, and they will send you, if you're a U.S. citizen, they will then send you your voter registration form, and then they'll send you a ballot because it's a mail-in ballot state. So this is a really, really unique way of thinking about the vote, that instead of making it more difficult to vote, they're going to try to make it as easy as possible to try to boost voter participation. And indeed, it's been working really well in Oregon. Voter registrations have basically quadrupled compared to previous election cycles just by doing this. And hopefully it'll be expanded beyond the DMV to other state agencies so that voter registration in Oregon will hopefully be as automatic as possible, that if you're a U.S. citizen and you're over the age of 18, you will be able to register to vote, which is very different than how a lot of other states controlled by Republicans right now are approaching the issue.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see the contrast between those two approaches. Finally, Ari, in some of the primaries, during the primary season, both Republican and Democrats, we saw massive lines of people trying to vote in states like Arizona. Can you talk a little bit about what can we expect more of that in the presidential election in November?
Yeah, I think it's very possible. I mean, the reason why there were long lines in Maricopa County, Arizona, which is home to Phoenix, is because that county eliminated 70% of their polling places. And that was something that nobody knew about. I didn't know about it, and I covered this stuff until Election Day when I saw these long lines. So I'm concerned that local jurisdictions, local counties will do these. There'll be very little advance notice, and it'll be very burdensome for voters. We're already seeing in states like North Carolina, for example, they're closing polling places on historically black campuses. They're closing precincts and polling stations in more democratic neighborhoods. So this stuff's very worrisome. And again, the legislature doesn't have to pass a law to do this. This could be done by local counties right before an election with very little advance notice. And so I think everyone has to remain really, really vigilant here, not just think, hey, we won some cases in court, this fight is over. Number one, there's still a lot of bad laws on the books. Number two, even in states where things have been struck down, there's still a lot of possibility for mischief, particularly with the Voting Rights Act weekend. So I think there's a lot to be vigilant about between now and Election Day.
All right, Ari Berman, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.